This evening there was a huge thunderstorm, enough to keep everyone indoors for the remainder of the day, but nothing hazardous. I'm among those who like storms and rainy evenings. It just makes me feel comfortable and at ease for some reason. I used to spend the night on the couch watching TV and listening to the rain whenever there was a night like this. Fortunately, I didn't have work the following day, so even though it was after 8 p.m., I made a nice cup of coffee and stayed up as late as I could to enjoy the comfortable evening. I took a seat and started watching a movie. My phone began ringing just 20 minutes into the film. I looked at the number when I picked it up, but I couldn't identify it. But this city was the source of the area code. I responded just in case, constantly concerned that it might be something significant or a person I knew, but didn't have their phone number saved. Hi there, nobody spoke. Can I assist you? Hi there. Nobody said anything, though. Strangely, though, I could tell it wasn't a dead line. Similar background noise was audible to me. It was disorganized. After giving it some thought, it sounded a little like the rain or storm outside. I was aware that someone was present, but they were silent. I hung up, feeling strange. I truly couldn't come up with an explanation. Someone would call and remain silent, even though it wasn't the usual robot voice or anything. I assumed it had to be an error or some sort of fraud. I put my phone back on the end table and carried on watching TV. I was about an hour into the film when, in an instant, the storm outside got getting louder. It picked up a lot of rain, lightning, and thunder. The lights and TV then flickered. They abruptly switched off and then rapidly turned back on. Uncertain of what was going on, I stopped the movie and looked about. Then, not even 30 seconds, the electricity went off later. The storm became twice as loud and the entire house became silent. For what seemed like 5 whole minutes, there was strong, continuous thunder, and rain was pouring onto the roof and against the windows. My only source of light was a tiny candle that I seldom ever used. Of course, I also had my phone, but since I didn't sure how long this would last, I didn't want to waste its charge. After lighting the candle, I decided to check the breaker box downstairs one more time. I discovered the switch was loose when I descended. I turned it over and over, but it was totally deceased. After returning upstairs, all I could do was watch the storm outside my window. It appeared to be a rather severe power outage because I also saw that every other home along the block was dark. Since my phone was using 5G data, I looked for any status updates. However, nothing was present. I was probably standing by the window for 15 minutes or so, watching and listening to the storm, when I suddenly heard something coming from outside the house. I knew the sound right away. It was my backyard gate swinging open. The gate was devoid of any kind of lock on it, yet it never simply opens that way. I went to the back of the house and peered out the back door as I had no idea what it might have been. I could see a man's shadow despite the wind, the darkness, and everything else. It was obvious that they had just arrived from the side of the gate. Was on, but all he was doing was standing in the center of the backyard in the rain. He appeared to be a dark figure because I could barely make out his shape. I had no idea where he was looking. For example, was he facing away from the house or toward it when he looked at me? I had no idea who he was. I felt uneasy about what I was doing out there. I was a little anxious, even though I knew I could have yelled at him to leave my property by opening the door. I mean, it wouldn't be out of the question to presume that he had a rifle or anything if he was insane enough to simply be strolling outdoors during such a powerful storm. I decided it would be best to avoid confronting them. I simply stood at the entrance and observed him. Before his arm slowly came out of his pocket and he placed his hand by his head, they remained motionless for a full minute. I could see a tiny bright light in his hand, but I had no idea what he was doing. My phone started buzzing in the other room as soon as I recognized what it was. I understood what was happening in less than 2 seconds. I got a call from this stranger outside my house. When he wasn't speaking before, I could hear the rain on the other end of the phone because of this, but it was an hour ago. Had he been standing outside my house during the entire storm? I ran into the living room in a panic, grabbed my phone, and made sure it was the same number. I returned to the door without responding. The man has vanished. I was terrified by this. Why didn't I just watch him from the door? I felt foolish. Even though I couldn't see him, I didn't enjoy being at the door since I knew he might be observing me from somewhere. I returned to the living room. I considered phoning the police, but I was at a loss for words. For example, I received 2 calls from someone who was outside my house, but I had no evidence that they were the same person or that they were doing anything improper other than being in my backyard. My phone called once more shortly after. I was somewhat expecting that, but it still made me jump. I was really terrified. Shortly after I turned down the call, there was a loud banging on the front door. They kept knocking on the door and called again. The house's walls were shaken by these powerful blows as well. I put my phone on quiet and I kind of froze up and did nothing, which was embarrassing. I realize that seems ridiculous, but I've never encountered such a circumstance. It was made worse by the storm and the power outage. I believe it took them 30 seconds before they started pounding the door even harder, prior to my eventual awakening and phone call to the police. I was holding the phone with trembling hands. They stated they were just 4 minutes away from me, and that an officer would be coming over immediately. The man didn't stop pounding on the door as I kept telling them everything I knew. This continued while I waited for the police officer to show up. At last, the operator informed me that they were on my street. I heard someone shouting a short while later. I saw the officer pursuing him as I rushed to the window. They bolted into the storm, after which I was unable to see anything. I believe I waited for 2 minutes before the cop returned with nothing. The man managed to escape. However, I was genuinely impressed by the police department's efforts to assist me. They appeared to take it seriously and conducted a rather extensive inquiry, most likely because they saw the man and pursued him. However, it turned out to be a dead end because the phone number was the sole actual lead. I tried to think of someone who might be trying to harm me in this way, but I couldn't think of anyone. I haven't had any calls from them since the case kinda died out. That figure or seen anything else. I can't recall the exact year this occurred, but the terror I experienced that night has never truly left me. Being so innocent simply makes it worse. It's one of those situations that you think will never happen to you, or that only occurs in movies. If you are unlucky enough to encounter something comparable, it will be 100 times more terrifying. It's ridiculous to think back on it, but I was young at the time, in middle school, kind of at that age when I was beginning to feel like I was growing up a bit. Feeling more like a man. In any case, it was summer. Thus, I spent the most of my days playing video games indoors or hanging out with my buddies outside. But this weekend was unique. To relive their honeymoon or something similar, my folks were going on a quick road trip to a city 8 hours away. The specifics didn't really matter to me, because all I could think about was how thrilled I was to have the house to myself and invite my buddies to stay overnight without any rules. They departed early on Saturday morning. They were therefore gone when I woke up. I texted Finn, my best friend, right away. The only problem was that if his parents found out there were no adults in the house, they would undoubtedly refuse to let him over. However, Finn was permitted to visit after a small amount of deceit. He wouldn't arrive at my house until later in the day, around 6 o'clock. However, I opened the front out of excitement. Windows so I could see when he arrived later, but as soon as I did, I saw a man outside. He was oddly close to the house, like past the sidewalk and somewhat near the garage, which was the only reason I gave a damn. He had an extremely unique appearance, tall and slender with a patchy beard and longish dark hair. I walked away from the window since it made me uncomfortable and I didn't want to be seen staring at him. When I hurriedly looked again a few minutes later, he had vanished. I didn't think it was noteworthy. The remainder of the day was relaxed, until Finn arrived at 6. I spent most of my time in my room playing on my Xbox. After grabbing some refreshments from the kitchen, we walked upstairs, essentially shut ourselves in my room, and spent 5 hours playing video games. Around 11:30, Finn exited the room to use the restroom while he was still playing Xbox. However, he returned about 30 seconds later and inquired as to if I had heard that. Not hearing anything, I inquired what. However, the entire house abruptly became dark before Finn could respond. Everything simply turned off, including the lights, Xbox, and TV. Finn was 5 feet away from me at the doorway and I couldn't even see him. I picked up my phone and switched on the flashlight after searching the floor with my hands for it. Finn and I remained silent for a moment. I was listening for the sound Finn claimed to have heard immediately before the blackout, but I was also perplexed as to why the electricity had abruptly cut off. When I finally asked him again what he heard after he had not heard anything and the power had not returned, Finn said he wasn't really sure. Perhaps with a thump or a step on the ground beneath us. However, we reasoned that it was probably merely related to the power going out. However, we were still unsure of the reason behind its shutdown. It was still a little uncomfortable because I was younger and the only person in the house. Being aware that we had to sort of what was happening, we went down to the first floor and out into the corridor. We heard the wind outside as soon as we left the room. It wasn't very unusual. but it was enough to raise the possibility that something might have gone wrong. But perhaps we were simply looking for something to blame. We were both unsure of what to do in this circumstance. I was a little hesitant to try anything, but I knew there was an electrical box in the basement that might somehow test or switch the power back on. Finn believed he might be, but I was able to figure it out, so I led him to the basement. The door was strangely open. Because basement was unfinished and only contained storage and sporadic old unused items, very few people go down there. But since my parents were traveling, I reasoned that perhaps they might have gone down to pick up some bags or whatever. I hadn't spent the entire day in the basement because the door was somewhat at the back of the house. The entire situation became a little more unpleasant as a result of this. Finn took the lead as we strolled down the street with our phone flashlights still on. Wooden stairs that creak and into the basement. It was rather small, like a broad hallway with concrete walls and a few boxes and loose objects piled up along the wall. It was, of course, very dark. Anything outside of our flashlight's direct line of sight was totally dark. We approached the electrical box. It was already partially exposed by the panel that covered it. Finn glanced about, but I believe that now that he was down here, he was as anxious about trying anything as I was. The primary bigger switch was however, just one was flipped to the other side. Naturally, we had no idea what this meant, but he hesitated a little before turning it over. All of the appliances on the floor above us immediately started making odd startup noises and a series of mild beeping sounds. However, we never even attempted to turn on the lights before descending down the basement, so it remained entirely black. The only light coming down the staircase from the first floor was a little sliver. We turned to head back down the hallway to the stairs, but before we could reach them, there was a loud shuffling noise coming from the opposite side of the basement. We both came to a stop, and I pointed my light in that way. Someone was standing there in the dark. As soon as I saw their outline in the light, I knew they were tall, slender, and had long, dark hair. I was unable to determine whether we were making eye contact or whether he was certain that we spotted him, because he was standing somewhat behind some boxes, casting a shadow over his face. I booked it up the stairs after turning around. Finn trailed closely behind. I shut the door behind us, and we simply immediately fled out the front door. It seemed sense that we were both freaking out. We dashed across the street, and I dialed 911. As we stood there with the lights on in every other house, it was very obvious that the man in the basement had turned off the electricity. While receiving information over the phone from the operator, we noticed a figure passing one of the windows downstairs. They then passed an upstairs window 15 seconds later. I believe it was the one leading to my parents' room, where they were exploring. However, we didn't see anything else for the next few minutes, before the police showed up. When they entered, no one was there. One of the rear windows had already been omitted. Naturally, my parents were contacted and many concerns were raised, but in the end, nothing was resolved. There are a lot of terrifying things to consider with what occurred that evening or might have occurred, such as how long that man had been keeping an eye on my family or the residents. What specifically was he attempting to accomplish by breaking in, turning off the electricity, and remaining concealed in the basement? Fortunately, my parents were astute enough to quickly relocate us from that home. I hope we never see that man again. I hope we never see that man again. I travel to my off-grid cabin in the Montana backcountry every 2 months. I purchased the property because of its extreme isolation, which was ideal. For quick getaways, I love being by myself in the trees and being away from everyone. This happened in the fall. I spent 5 days on a whim. I decided to go 3 hours north to my cabin on my weekend off from work. I hadn't gotten any additional sleep beforehand, so I didn't prepare much, so the travel was a little exhausting. Around 7:00 p.m., I arrived at the cottage. The cabin was reached by a long, lonely dirt road that wound through the forest. Everything was a little challenging to get around in the dark, but as I reached the front, I parked, emptied my luggage, threw everything inside, and went back to turn on the generator. A gas generator powered the entire cabin. Thus, a single tiny generator powered the lights, outlets, and even the electric stovetop. It was always sufficient for me because I never used much power. I filled up the gas tank, turned on the wood stove, and walked inside to warm up. It gets quite chilly in the fall up here in northern Montana. I believe that throughout the fall, it frequently dropped below 25 degrees at night where my cabin was located. I never even tried to visit the cabin during the harsh winters. In any case, I was only up for an hour or so prior to bedtime. I spent the following day cleaning, primarily dusting everything off and caulking minor cabin wall cracks. However, I happened to see an old vehicle traveling down the dirt trail to the cottage in the middle of the day. They were driving amongst the woods, but as they approached, they came to a stop. After perhaps 5 minutes of sitting, they turned around and departed. I assumed they had somehow taken the wrong path and probably had a cabin of their own someplace nearby, so I didn't really give it much thought. I lit a campfire on the front porch at around 10 o'clock at night, since I wanted to spend some time in nature. This would provide the wood stove with. I would have more time before bed to warm up the cabin as well. I went to the porch after grabbing some old fire starters that I had left behind months before. I threw a few logs into the small fire pit I had outside and ignited it. The first few nights spent at the cabin, simply listening to the peaceful forest, were always very pleasant. Peaceful sounds of nature. However, the outdoor porch light abruptly went out after I had only been seated there for 5 or 10 minutes. I turned to check behind me and saw that the cabin's lights were completely out. The wood burner was the only source of the faint orange illumination. That's when I realized the generator wasn't making a lot of noise. It was no longer operating. I got up and walked around the back, annoyed. It turned out to be off. I gave up and kicked it out of frustration after cranking it a couple times in an attempt to get it back on after 10 solid attempts. I assumed it was just an old generator breaking down and malfunctioning, which is what old generators do best. However, when I checked the gas after realizing my mistake, it was empty. What on earth? When I arrived at the cabin last night, I had just filled it to the brim with an entire canister. It hardly had a chance of passing through it that fast. There were no indications of a leak or anything, so I looked around the lawn. I was genuinely perplexed. Since I didn't have any extra, I honestly didn't know how it was possible. As a result, I wouldn't have power until at least tomorrow morning when I could go into town and fill up. I realized it wasn't really that big of a deal despite the inconvenience. I didn't really need any lights because I had a wood stove to heat the space and I was going to bed shortly anyhow. I returned to the porch and took a seat in an attempt to regain my composure, so that I could at least enjoy the remainder of the evening. However, I noticed something in the woods in a matter of seconds. Off to the right of the dirt trail, sort of among all the trees, was a person, or at least something that looked like a person. I leaned forward in an attempt to get a closer look, but whatever I was seeing was so still and black that I couldn't tell if it was a person or simply an odd-looking shape like a bush. Since it wasn't moving at all, I kind of stopped staring at it after a few minutes and returned to simply relaxing and taking in the quiet night. However, a minute later, when I occurred to look back at the woodland, I was unable to locate it. I searched for it for a few more minutes, supposing I had simply forgotten its precise location, but I was still unable to find it. To be honest, I felt a little uneasy about that. That may have been one of the most unsettling things I'd encountered in a long time. Even though I wouldn't describe myself as paranoid, clearly it should still be exactly where I last saw it, even if it was just a bush or something. Thinking about that gave me chills. For the next 30 minutes, I kept my gaze fixed on the forest. The peaceful atmosphere that pervaded the trees surrounding the home now seemed unsettling. I had a feeling that someone was watching me or that I wasn't alone. Something wasn't right, especially when the generator stopped working. Then I suppose it would have been close to 12 a.m. when I heard an abrupt sound to my left, perhaps from a tree or something else like a stick falling to the ground. I gazed in that direction into the darkness, kind of keeping an eye out for any movement. However, I turned back to the front of the cabin after 30 seconds. My heart nearly stopped. That figure was back, standing where it had been. Then I saw more and more. Just 100 yards distant, there were perhaps a dozen figures standing out between the trees. They were all standing in the dark, silent and undoubtedly facing the cabin. My body entered flight mode and I scrambled to my feet and hurried into the cabin. For a minute I stood behind the door, gathering my thoughts and contemplating whether or not to glance out the window. I finally worked up the guts to look. The figures had all vanished. There was nobody in the wilderness. I was on the verge of being even more afraid as a result, but I didn't have much time to reflect before hearing footsteps coming from the rear of the cabin. There may have been more footsteps, but I believe I could clearly hear 4 or 5. I shut the front window blinds right away. I heard all of these strangers strolling slowly through the cabin. However, they remained clustered together, as if they were not encircling the cabin or anything. It didn't sound like it, at least. I held my breath as they approached the front, and I could hear their boots pounding on the wooden porch directly outside. The entrance. I honestly believed that this was it. I was afraid to try to look out. The gathering outside my cabin was unsettlingly silent. as if their footfall were the only sound they produced. However, they all moved in unison, such as they were skilled at what they did. What in the world was a gang like this doing in the woods in the middle of nowhere? However, after a few minutes of waiting, I realized that they were simply standing on the other side of the door, presumably waiting for me to attempt to leave at some point. I ultimately made the decision to screw it after 10 minutes. I'll attempt to take a gaze out the window. I shifted a small portion of the blind so that I could hardly see through it with one eye as I stealthily approached. There was nobody on the porch. There was no one out there. Without ever making a sound, the entire group had vanished. I grabbed nothing but my car keys before running out of the cabin, getting into my car and driving away from those woods. Along the remote gravel road, I half expected the group to be waiting. It was, after all, slender and traveling through the pitch-black forest at night. I was able to see it without seeing anyone else, even though they might have easily blocked it off or whatever. I'm not totally sure what happened to me that evening in the cabin. There were a lot of individuals stalking me at my off-grid cabin and sneaking about the forest that night, presumably depleting my generator, but doing nothing about it. It simply doesn't make sense. What on earth were they attempting to accomplish? Regretfully, I am at a loss for answers. However, I'm interested in hearing theories from anyone who believes they may know the identity of this gang or what they were attempting to accomplish. Since then, I haven't returned to the cabin. But someday I'll have to return because I own the property. To be honest, I'm afraid of the responses I may discover.